Every empire begins with a story it tells itself. For Rome, that story was glory, a belief that its legions, its laws, and its gold were unshakable pillars of destiny. It began as a small city-state on the banks of the Tiber, trading goats and grain, and ended ruling from Britain to Babylon. And yet, at the heart of its rise was a silent flaw, an illusion so powerful that even emperors believed it, that wealth could be created by decree, and that the value of money was whatever Rome said it was. It was the trillion-dollar mistake of the ancient world, not made in a single moment, not with one decision, but over centuries, layer by layer, coin by coin, until the most powerful empire on earth went bankrupt under the weight of its own promises. In the beginning, Rome didn't need illusions. Its wealth was real, hammered in gold, silver, and bronze, carried home from conquered kingdoms. When Roman legions marched into Gaul, Spain, Egypt, and Asia Minor, they didn't just bring back glory, they brought metal, gold from Spanish mines, silver from Greek treasuries, grain from Egypt, slaves from everywhere. Each victory filled the coffers of the state. Each triumph parade through the Forum reminded the people that expansion was prosperity. Rome's economy was built not on productivity, but on plunder. The empire didn't need to manufacture value because it could seize it. As long as the conquest continued, the illusion held. The people believed Rome could never run out of wealth because the world, it seemed, would never run out of enemies to conquer. For centuries, this model worked. The Roman treasury overflowed. Senators built marble villas, emperors constructed monuments, and the coin of Rome, the silver denarius, became the backbone of the ancient world's economy. From London to Jerusalem, merchants trusted the face of Caesar stamped in silver. That trust was the foundation of empire. But every empire reaches a moment when it stops expanding, when the frontiers grow too large, the wars too costly, and the victories too rare. For Rome, that moment came quietly. The conquest slowed, the flow of treasure thinned, but the spending did not. Rome's greatest enemy was not Carthage, not the barbarians, not even internal revolts. Its greatest enemy was its own appetite. By the 1st century AD, Rome had become a machine that needed constant feeding. Soldiers' pay, grain for the poor, circuses for the masses, and marble palaces for the elite. Emperors discovered that power depended not just on the sword, but on keeping the people and the army satisfied. And satisfaction costs money. When the treasury ran dry, emperors didn't stop spending. They did what modern governments do. They created more money, but in the ancient world that didn't mean printing paper. It meant debasement, reducing the precious metal in coins while pretending nothing had changed. At first it was subtle, a few less grams of silver in the denarius, a little more copper mixed in. No one noticed, or rather, no one wanted to notice. After all, the coins still looked the same. It still bore the emperor's face. It still bought bread. But the illusion had begun. The first great manipulator of Roman money was Emperor Nero. Known for his vanity and excess, Nero also made one of the most consequential economic decisions in history. In 64 AD, after the Great Fire of Rome, he faced a city in ruins and an empire demanding reconstruction. But rebuilding costs gold, and the treasury was strained by wars and extravagance. So Nero did something new. He reduced the purity of the silver denarius by about 10%, and the gold aureus by nearly the same. To the average Roman, nothing seemed different. But in truth, Nero had discovered what emperors and central bankers ever since have never forgotten. You can buy time by faking value. By minting more coins from the same amount of metal, Nero could pay soldiers, fund projects, and sustain appearances for a while. It was Rome's first step down a road that would end in economic ruin. The denarius, once 95% pure silver, would fall to less than 2% over the next 2 centuries. It was as if the US dollar, once backed by gold, slowly became backed by nothing but hope and habit. Every emperor after Nero learned the same trick, and every emperor pushed it further. Why raise taxes and anger the people when you could quietly create new money? Why admit decline when you could pretend abundance? The army became the greatest consumer of this illusion. By the 3rd century, Rome had hundreds of thousands of troops to pay, each demanding silver that no longer existed. To keep them loyal, emperors minted more coins, and each new coin bought a little less. Prices rose, trust fell, and still they called it stability. The Roman people grew used to seeing prices climb, savings shrink, and merchants charge more for less. The government blamed foreigners, hoarders, and speculators, anyone but itself. But the truth was simple. Rome was printing its way to poverty. The 2nd century AD was Rome's peak, the era of the 5 good emperors of peace, prosperity, and architectural wonder. But beneath the marble, the cracks were spreading. Even as the empire appeared unshakable, its money was dying. When Emperor Caracalla came to power in 198 AD, he faced a familiar problem. Too much army, too little gold. His solution was bold and disastrous. He created a new coin, the Antoninianus, worth 2 denarii but containing only about 1.5 denarii worth of silver. It was a lie stamped in metal, and like all lies, it demanded more lies to sustain it. Prices exploded. Merchants demanded higher payments. Soldiers wanted raises to keep up with inflation. To meet those demands, emperors minted more coins, and the cycle accelerated. By the time of Emperor Gallienus in the mid-3rd century, the Antoninianus contained almost no silver at all, just a thin coating over base metal. The empire that had once ruled through gold now ruled through illusion. By now, the pattern should feel eerily familiar. Every empire, ancient or modern, believes it can spend without limit, print without consequence, and buy loyalty with promises instead of value. Rome was simply the first to prove that even the greatest civilization can bankrupt itself through denial. The effects were devastating. Soldiers refused to accept wages in debased coinage. Farmers abandoned fields rather than sell crops for worthless money. Trade routes slowed. Inflation became chaos. A loaf of bread that once cost a few denarii now cost hundreds. And when money dies, order dies with it. The empire began to fracture, not just politically, but economically. Regions stopped sending taxes to Rome. Local governors hoarded gold or minted their own coins. Trust in the central authority, the heart of any empire, evaporated. The Roman people didn't need economists to tell them what was happening. They could feel it every time they went to market. The coins that once carried the power of the empire now carried only disappointment. The tragedy of Rome was not that it made a mistake, but that it refused to admit it had made one. Generation after generation of emperors inherited the same broken system and doubled down on the illusion. Debasement wasn't a scandal anymore. It was policy. And like all illusions sustained too long, it became identity. Rome still called itself eternal, still told its citizens they lived in the greatest civilization on earth. But by the 3rd century, that greatness was a memory financed by counterfeit prosperity. The empire had turned its money into fiction, and the fiction had become reality. A society that once built roads, aqueducts, and laws that still shape our world was now collapsing under its own deceit. It was the trillion-dollar mistake, not in paper or digital numbers, but in trust, in the invisible contract between ruler and ruled. When that trust broke, no amount of silver could repair it. Every modern nation that prints its way out of debt or spends beyond its means is repeating the same story, only with different symbols. Rome's coins were stamped with emperors' faces. Ours are stamped with presidents and prime ministers. But the logic is identical. The belief that confidence alone can replace value. The Roman people didn't realize they were living through one of history's greatest financial collapses, not until it was too late. To them, it was just the way things were now. The prices rose, the coins changed, and the empire that had conquered the world slowly consumed itself. The lesson, like the empire, is eternal. Every illusion of wealth ends in the same way, with the rediscovery of reality. And for Rome, that rediscovery was coming fast. The next chapter would not be about illusion, but about collapse. A collapse not of armies or borders, but of money itself. And when money dies, so does empire. The empire that had once conquered the known world now faced a truth it could not escape. Money without value is power without substance. The coins of Rome, once the backbone of civilization, were now little more than metal discs stamped with empty promises. The denarius and the Antoninianus, once symbols of trust and stability, had become instruments of decay, a currency so hollow that even the mightiest legionnaires began to question its worth. By the mid-3rd century, Rome was no longer a city of triumph. It was a society teetering on the edge of financial chaos, a house of silver and bronze built on nothing but illusion. And the mistakes of centuries, the debasements, the overspending, the addiction to conquest as currency, now came home to roost. Emperors who came after Gallienus attempted to stabilize the empire, but the mechanisms they employed only worsened the problem. Coins were minted with less and less silver, while prices soared to keep pace with the flood of currency. Soldiers, already wary, demanded ever larger salaries. Farmers refused to sell crops for worthless coins. Merchants began hoarding real goods instead of accepting debased currency. Inflation was no longer a subtle whisper. It became a deafening roar. Bread that once cost a few denarii now demanded hundreds. A soldier's paycheck could not buy the simplest meal. Trust, which had once bound the empire together, disintegrated. Emperor Diocletian, faced with what was by then a full-blown economic crisis, tried to legislate value. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, an attempt to fix wages and prices by decree. But laws cannot create wealth. The edict was ignored, defied, and ultimately ridiculed. It failed because money had already lost its meaning, and the empire learned a harsh lesson. Control cannot substitute for value. The army, once the most loyal pillar of the empire, now became a force of instability. Legions were paid in coins that could barely feed them. Mutinies erupted as soldiers demanded tangible rewards, land, gold, or grain, rather than worthless denarii. The very instrument of Rome's expansion now threatened its survival. Generals seized the throne by force, installing emperors who promised pay and privileges. This barracks politics further drained the treasury and fueled debasement. The empire was trapped in a vicious cycle. To buy loyalty, it needed money. To make money, it debased coins. Debased coins caused inflation. Inflation destroyed loyalty. The collapse was self-reinforcing. Rome's economy relied on the flow of goods across vast distances: grain from Egypt, olive oil from Hispania, wine from Gaul. But as debasement worsened, trade slowed. Merchants refused to accept coins whose value fluctuated daily. Markets became localized. Long-distance trade, once the lifeblood of empire, broke down. Borders were not just political lines. They became economic fault lines. A denarius in Rome was not worth the same in Antioch or Alexandria. The empire that had once spanned continents now fractured into pockets of barter, distrust, and opportunism. And the common people suffered most. They could not hoard gold or land like the elite. Their savings, often literal coins in small jars, became meaningless overnight. Families that had relied on wages, rents, and local commerce suddenly faced ruin. Rome, which had promised stability and protection, had failed in the most fundamental contract of all, the preservation of wealth. When trust in money evaporates, people turn to what cannot be printed or manipulated. In Rome, this meant land, slaves, and bullion. The wealthy converted their paper into tangible assets. Farmers with silver hoarded it. Merchants stored grain and wine. Coins that could be stamped again and again were abandoned in favor of things that could not be reproduced. This flight of real wealth further starved the treasury. Rome needed silver to pay soldiers and administrators, but the silver was no longer circulating. It was hidden, hoarded, or moved abroad. Every attempt to mint more coins only exacerbated the problem. The empire was caught in a paradox. To survive, it needed wealth it could not touch. To generate wealth, it needed trust it no longer commanded. Economic collapse did not exist in isolation. As money lost value, politics became violent. Usurpers rose, provinces declared independence. Military coups became common. The very institutions meant to hold the empire together, the Senate, the bureaucracy, the provincial governors, were powerless against the corrosive force of economic decay. Even emperors with grand ambitions found themselves trapped. Diocletian and Constantine, who later reformed currency and administration, did so not because the empire was stable, but because it teetered on the brink of disintegration. Their reforms could slow the collapse, but they could not reverse centuries of debasement and mismanagement. Rome's fall teaches a chilling lesson. People, not policies, define the value of money. No emperor, no law, no coin could force trust where it no longer existed. When citizens and soldiers alike stop believing, even the mightiest empire crumbles. The trillion-dollar mistake was not just in debasement. It was in the belief that appearances could replace reality. The empire spent, minted, legislated, and hoped that confidence could sustain a system already hollowed from within. It could not. The fall of Rome is not an isolated story. Every modern fiat currency, every government reliant on debt and printing, walks the same line. Trust remains the invisible currency, and once it fails, everything else follows. Consider the hyperinflations of modern history: Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. The patterns are identical: overspending, devaluation, flight to tangible assets, social unrest. Rome, in its grandeur, was the first great example, but it is far from the last. The lesson is timeless. Money is trust, and trust is fragile. Emperors thought gold and silver could sustain loyalty. They were wrong. Today, governments and central banks hope confidence alone can keep economies afloat. History whispers a warning. It cannot. By the late 3rd century, the denarius was almost entirely worthless. Inflation, regional fragmentation, and military instability had eroded every ounce of centralized power. Rome's emperors, soldiers, merchants, and citizens all realized the same truth. The empire had spent more than it could ever earn. And yet, the empire survived, politically, militarily, culturally, for another century in the West and even longer in the East. But survival was not prosperity. It was a testament to adaptation, to reform, and to the stubborn inertia of institutions, a shadow of former greatness. The economy, once the engine of conquest, was reduced to a cautionary tale. The trillion-dollar mistake of Rome was not a single error. It was a systemic failure, a century-long addiction to illusion, a belief that money could exist without value, a society convinced that trust could be manufactured by decree. And as modern viewers, we can read these lessons as a mirror. Wealth in paper, digital, or silver is meaningless without trust. Overspending and debasement may offer temporary relief, but guarantee long-term collapse. The flight of real value, land, gold, skills, is inevitable when confidence fails. Rome's story is not just about coins and emperors, it is about human nature. It is about the fragility of trust, the inevitability of economic reality, and the eternal consequences of ignoring them. In the end, the empire did not fall because of barbarians at the gates, but because it spent the future it could never repay. And the currency of trust that had bound society together became worthless. And as history has shown time and time again, the lesson of Rome is simple and unforgiving. When money loses meaning, power loses everything.